Wonderful. Good afternoon, everybody. We start this session with a greeting by Professor David Harael, the president of the Israel Academy. Please.
Thank you, Daniel. אחר צהריים טובים, ככל ההרצאות במושב הזה, גם הדברים שלי יהיו באנגלית. יהיו טיפה יותר ארוכים מהברכה הרגילה, ותכף תבינו למה. Dear Gavison family, dear participants and distinguished guests, both here at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, as well as those who are watching us live online. This conference is a unique joint initiative of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the Van Leer Institute, in memory of our dear colleague and member of the Academy, Professor Ruth Gavison, Ruti for the people close to her, who passed away in August 2020. 4 terms make up the title of our conference: nationalism, liberalism, Judaism, and democracy, and they nicely express the 4 cornerstones that constituted Ruti's extraordinarily brilliant and bold persona. Almost every book, article, opinion, policy statement, or lecture emanating from her pen or keyboard proposed an enlightening analysis that deviated from conventional research, and often in ways that incorporated 2 or more of these 4 cornerstones. Moreover, Ruti's writings were very often controversial, a fact that is deeply characteristic of her scientific and public profile. In the next few minutes, I would like to concentrate on one of her activities that is not explicitly represented at the conference, but which, in my humble opinion, is of great importance. I refer to the Gavison-Medan Covenant, a revolutionary, constitution-like social document for regulating religious and secular relations in the State of Israel, which Ruth Gavison authored with Yaakov Medan, an Orthodox rabbi who has been co-head of the Alon Shvut Yeshiva, Rosh Yeshiva Shutaf, for many years. The Covenant's text was made public in 2003, almost 20 years ago, but sadly it has had far, far less impact than it truly deserves. In talking about the surprising joint work of these 2 giants, I feel humbly at home, being lucky to have known both of them very well. Ruti was not only a fellow member of our academy, but also someone to talk to, and in my case, often someone to spar with, but always to learn from, on issues of equality, justice, human rights, freedom, and peace. Rabbi Medan, on the other hand, was a classmate and friend for the 4 years we attended the Netiv Meir High School Yeshiva together in the 1960s, and once in a while he and I were even a part-time chevruta. To us he was Yaakov, but very often simply Medan. By the way, Rabbi Medan could not be with us today due to the wedding of one of his daughters this evening. Let us all wish the family a hearty mazal tov. Getting back to this odd couple, quotes, one would be hard-pressed to find a more different pair of brilliant and deep thinkers, though crucially they shared a true love for Israel and for Judaism, but were equally concerned about their future. In addition, they were both endowed with a rare openness to considering opinions differing from their own. So what has happened to their covenant? Not much. The reaction to the conceptual shatnez embodied in their document was rather cool. Here is how Ruti put it in her own typically witty manner. Quote, one person described the Covenant project as delusional, hazui. In the dictionary, I found that delusional means steeped in illusion, in a dream state, unrealistic. I would be happy to take part in other delusional schemes of this nature as opposed to the more realistic, failed ones. End of quote. In fact, the Covenant did not earn the attention it deserved at all, not only from the public, but nor from the Knesset or the government. However, the very fact that it was the result of such an unusual collaboration between an esteemed secular liberal and publicly known scholar of the law and a highly revered rabbinical leader and yeshiva educator, continues to this very day to be of great eye-opening interest. Now, while there were numerous points in the covenant on which the two agreed, often quite surprising agreements, I would like to focus on one of their main disagreements. One of Rabbi Medan's main principles was illustrated using the parable of the single ship, Haonia Achat. In his own words, quote, the Jewish people entered this covenant, here he means Abrit, lo mismach, as a people and not as individuals. And the commandments we keep have a collective significance, not an individual one. This is the meaning of the mutual responsibility that connects all Jews, Arvut Adadit, which refers not only to a shared struggle for existence and mutual aid, but also to the collective fulfillment of the commandments required to uphold the Sinai covenant, Brit Sinai. This mutual responsibility affords the nation its identity. The individual has no escape from this framework, much as a person who sails on a ship cannot abandon the ship or his commitment to its safety in mid-ocean. Mutual responsibility, Rabbi Medan continues, became even more powerful when a distinct association was established for the sake of a single purpose, a single ship, the State of Israel. In my view, this association must be for the sake of heaven, L'Shem Shamayim. End of quote. To this principle of Rabbi Yaakov Medan, Ruti provides a very interesting response, again in her typical Gavizon style. Quote, I have no shared existential commitment to protect the integrity of the ship, of religiously observant Jews, simply because I would never have sailed on it to begin with. Naturally, I wish to see observant Jews flourish, and I will fight to ensure that no one harms them, but I myself feel no personal commitment to preserving this special way of life. From my point of view, there are three ships, Ruti Gavizon says, the ship of the Torah, the ship of the entire Jewish people, and the ship of the state. I sail only on the latter two, and definitely have a deep personal interest in the third of these, which is actually the instrument that enables me to live a meaningful life here, both as an individual and as a member of a Jewish collective. End of quote. Gavizon and Medan disagreed on some central substantive issues, and admirably, they did not hide these disputes. For example, she proposed eliminating the nationality, haleom, clause from the population register and from our identity cards, whereas he suggested leaving them, and he added that a person would be allowed to state his or her nationality as simply the people of Israel, Am Yisrael, Betor Leom, if that person was born to a Jewish mother or a Jewish father or had converted. While some of the disputes between the two remained unresolved, some of the agreed-upon positions expressed in their covenant provoked extremely strong criticism, which interestingly came very often from within Gavizon's own liberal habitat. One of them concerned the legal recognition of same-sex marriage. In her words, quote, I personally believe that the permanent bonding of homosexual couples is an important emotional factor for them, and that there is a real social interest in recognizing this facet of an intimate relationship and in finding methods to establish and reinforce it. On the other hand, I am not convinced that these couples have the right to demand legal recognition of their commitment as a marriage in every sense of that word. However, this is an important cultural debate, not a legal issue deriving from the subject of basic rights. End quote. It is fascinating to revisit the Gavizon-Medan covenant today when the religious rift in Israel seems to have become an open wound that can no longer be cured. Still, Gavizon's character, as it emerges from the document even years after its publication, portrays a deep, wise, solid, uncompromising person equipped with an unbending, independent backbone who refuses to align even with the basic positions of her own millet. Thus, to give a personal example, she and I were at rather serious odds regarding the wisdom of petitioning to the Supreme Court on the issue of forbidding a person standing trial for serious corruption charges like bribery from becoming prime minister, an activity in which I was heavily involved. I found myself deeply respecting her opinion despite the significant disagreement. Even at the height of that conflict, I could sense her wisdom, her integrity, and her courage, which was a far cry from your typical law expert or scholar immersed in the dry analysis of the written word or in the squabbles of the researchers analyzing it. Ruti was also active within the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities in a committee we set up in the early months of the COVID-19 to examine the balancing needs, values, and policies in times of national crisis, chaired by Professor Moshe Halbertal. Ruti helped formulate substantive questions concerning the ethical and constitutional challenges of dealing with a state of emergency and a pandemic. Unfortunately for us all, she passed away after the first stage of the committee's work and did not get to see the job done. So here we are now, and I'm sure that these 2 days will be an exciting and inspiring meeting which will illuminate new facets of the life and work of Professor Ruth Gavison, providing us all with much food for thought. I would like to thank the organizing committee of the conference, led by Professor Eliezer, former president of the Academy, who also chaired the committee, Professor Yoav Dotan, former dean of the Hebrew University's Faculty of Law, and Professor Shai Lavi, head of the Van Leer Institute. Thank you all for coming, and let's have an enjoyable conference.
Well, thank you, Professor Harael, for this very interesting speech, and also for illuminating some aspects of Ruth Gavison activities. Well, this conference is held to commemorate Ruth Gavison, and I shall try not to repeat what Professor Harael did say about her, and he said, and he pointed to many interesting aspects of her unique work, but her work was so broad that there are a few points that I can still add without repeating what was said before. Gavison was a member of the Israeli National Academy, a leading scholar who acquired worldwide reputation in the fields of jurisprudence and human rights. A well-known article on privacy is probably the most quoted article on the subject. And yet, Gavison's impact goes much beyond the areas of her legal specialization. In the early 19th of the last century, Gavison began to criticize the Supreme Court for its over-involvement in political and other issues, which belonged to other branches of the government. At the time, it was a single voice, but it was subsequently joined by many others. Gavison was appointed to the chair of human rights, named in honor of the legendary Justice Chaim-Cohen. She was also the president of the Israel Society for Human Rights. And yet, the values and policies relating to human rights were her special interest, and she had a special way of looking at things. The fundamental issues that concerned human rights, Zionism, and relations with the Palestinians, and on a broader level, the relationship in general between universal human rights and national policies and aspiration was one of the focuses of her work. Human rights charters typically advocate the equality of all human beings. And yet, no country in the world treats its own citizens and other people and people of other countries on equal footing. There is some things that seem not to fit exactly, and there is a way, or there should be a way, trying to accommodate them, which is not very easy, and we know this from the problems of refugees and many other problems we meet here with minorities. In one case, which concerned the establishment of a Jewish village in an area mainly inhabited by Arabs, the Supreme Court applied the universal concept of equality and held that Arabs may acquire apartments and houses in this village, although in the past villages were established in Israel specifically for Arabs, notably for the Bedouin population. In this context, Gavison succinctly remarked that and pointed out that though Jews constitute the majority in this country, in Israel, the Jews are a very small minority, actually a tiny minority, in an area that is dominated by people, many of whom are hostile to the state of Israel and actually seek its annihilation. In other areas, the other area in which Gavison acquired dominant influence is that of state and religion and the relations of secular and religious communities in Israel. Professor Ha'el illuminated this very important aspect of her work, which I think will be a lasting influence on Israel's thinking, and we shall probably come back to it over and over again. Other thinking, ideas, and views on political theory will also have a lasting effect and hopefully will help to ease some of the tensions which continue to haunt us. We shall now start with the first session, and our first speaker is Professor Yuli Tamir. Yuli Tamir, she is the president of Beit College and adjunct professor at the Balvatnik School of Government in Oxford. She was deputy speaker of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, and served as Israel Minister of Immigration between 1999 and 2001, and Minister of Education in the government of Ehud Olmert from 2006 and 2009. She was a Minister in Education representing the Labour Party. By the way, if I may add, I was also a member of this government, so we served together for some time. I had the pleasure and honor of serving with her together in the same government. Tamir received her BA and MA from the Hebrew University and a PhD in political philosophy from Oxford University. Tamir is a leading personality in area of liberal nationalism. She also authored a book on liberal nationalism published by Princeton University, and also she's also a leading authority on the concept of equality, a rather complex concept, which is a topic of innumerable argument and court decision. She's also a leading figure in the field of political philosophy, and education, feminism, and human rights. We are greatly honored to have her with us and look forward to listen to her speech.
Thank you for this lovely introduction. I sound like I'm 200 years old. Good afternoon, actually. I'm delighted to be here. I'm really sorry Professor Michael Wולtzar couldn't join us. I think I'm looking forward to hear his contribution. And I think, like all of us, I had many encounters with Ruti Gavison over the years. I was trying to write something that is a little bit more comprehensive about her work rather than going from one argument to another, because that could always be debatable, but just to look at the largest picture. So, if one was asked to describe Ruth Gabizon in one word, one would probably say brilliant, sharp, knowledgeable, determined, firm-minded. I doubt if anyone would say compromising. Ruth was a fiercely combative speaker, sharp and acute analyzers of text and individuals, a person with little patience for small talks or niceties. Yet in this short talk, I would like to claim that compromises were her life project. Not minor practical compromises, but essential ideological ones, the kind that could determine the future of the state she was committed to. The last note Ruth sent Professor Yedidia Stern regarding a course on Israeli democracy created by Yad Nadiv said the following: the Israeli society is currently in crisis, but its social and political roots are more robust and resilient than the polarizing discourse. Our academic course on democracy, Jewish nationalism, and human rights must serve to fortify the sense along all the components of the Israeli society, individuals and groups, that they are partners in working together to its flourishment, and are free to sound their voices and act to promote their own interests. Indeed, the structuring of the course was an exercise in compromising, in being able to firmly defend your opinion and at the same time be very modest about them. It is tempting to believe that at some higher level of abstraction, all good things could be reconciled. Yet, as Azar Berlin taught us, this is no more than a sentimental, somewhat childish wish for an urge for certainty and consistency. The general truth is intensified by the Israeli reality. With so many voices competing for attention in the public sphere, no other result but cacophony could be expected. That may not be very pleasing to the ear, but it is not necessarily a vice. The more open and diverse a society is, the least coherent its public sphere will be. We often complain about this incoherence, yet it is a sign of collective maturity, of an ability to settle for a livable compromise. Ideological compromises are a reflection of constantly changing social, political, and economic conditions. Hence, they call for an ongoing democratic dialogue. A compromise, Gutman and Thompson argue, is an agreement in which all sides sacrifice something in order to improve on the status quo from their perspective, and in which the sacrifice is at least partly determined by the other's will. The sacrifice involves not merely getting less than you think you deserve. The sacrifice typically involves trimming your principles. The compromising mindset displays what we call, Gutman and Thompson call, principles prudence, adapting one's principles and mutual respect. In contrast, the uncompromising mindset manifests principle tenacity, standing on principles, and mutual mistrust. If coherence is not the major tool for evaluating compromises, how do we know if they are morally valid? Some ideological compromises are better than others, and some could be virtuous, and some could even be rotten. According to Avishai Margalit, a rotten compromise is a political compromise which is an agreement to establish or maintain an inhuman regime, a regime of cruelty and humiliation. That is a regime that does not treat humans as humans. That certainly is a very low threshold. So what kind of compromises should we be seeking? To begin with, the moral value of a compromise could be judged by the morality of the principles it balances. One rotten apple can spoil the whole barrel. We may therefore wish to carefully evaluate the ideologies we bring to the table. For example, one can claim that ideologies that call for violations of basic human rights are to be excluded. Others may argue that compromises that overrule religious law, national loyalties, or personal freedom should be rejected. Hence, the first step, taking out the rotten apple, may also be the last one. Actually, we were here, I think, in Van Leer about 20 years ago, trying to draft some sort of an agreement on Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, and we came to the, I think, the third word, Israel is and that's where it ended. We couldn't get any further. So dialogues concerning the two issues Ruth Gabizon cared about the most, the democratic nature of the state and the Jewish nature of the state, often fail at this very initial stage. This did not deter Gabizon from searching for a way to accommodate conflicting ideas, some of which contradicted her own basic beliefs, as she saw the compromise as a precondition to the continuous existence of the State of Israel. While ideological compromises are inevitable, an important aspect of diverse democracy, they are highly underrated. Most leaders do not launch a compromising campaign, and when they do so, they are often criticized. We applaud standing on one's principle, but have you ever heard a crowd shouting, "Compromise, compromise"? There is no great epic about a compromiser, and no one is going to make a cult movie featuring Laurence Olivier as King Henry V, sitting on a white horse, dramatically stating, "And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhood cheap, while any speaks of the compromises we made in the Crispian day." There is a good reason for this state of affair. Theories of moral development, from Kant to Kohlberg to Rawls, see the ability to follow principles as the apex of moral development. From Kant's categorical imperative to Kohlberg's sixth and final stage of moral reasoning, morality is supposed to be based on universal ethical principle and abstract reasoning. At the higher level, Kohlberg argues, people follow these internalized principles of justice, even if they conflict with laws and norms. Developing our personality, choosing the principle we adhere to, we define who we are. In this respect, compromises involve always a blow to one's self-definition. And yet, compromises play an important role in the way we live our lives. We should, Avishai Margalit argue, be judged by our compromises more than by our ideals and norms. Ideals may tell us something important about what we would like to be, but compromises tell us who we are. Most of us don't find this definition pleasing. We want to be what we mean to be. This is why necessity is a precondition to compromising. It allows us to say to ourselves, I wouldn't have stuck to my principle unless. The more weight we put on the unless, the more likely we are to settle the cognitive dissonance between what we want to be and what we really are. This is why a prelude to every compromise, including the Gabizon-Meidan compromise and other compromises he was involved in, is always an exaggeration. We are at a historical turning point on the verge of collapse, or we're going to be stuck with Bibi forever. That's the real move that makes us move away from our principles and do what is necessary to do. Realizing the importance of compromise may lead individuals in conflicting directions. It could induce a desire to lower one's demands in order to reach an agreement, or it could lead to overstating one's demands in order to bring the compromise closer to home. In terms of game theory, it is always more profitable to be the less willing and more extreme party unless the high price or one's stubbornness fails the attempt to reach a compromise, and then one is forced to pay the price. Think about Golda in the days she could maybe have been compromising with Sadat before the Yom Kippur War, and the criticism after the war. Compromises, Margalit argues, should be dealt with on retail basis, one by one. They should be judged on their merit. Yet a high level of uncertainty and the inability to predict the behavior of the other makes the art of evaluating compromises exceptionally difficult. Criticizing criticizing someone to have gone too far, we usually mean the result did not justify the ideological price paid. Is there a way to weigh the ideological loss embedded in compromise against the gains? As the price precedes the gain, uncertainty creeps in. Are compromises to be evaluated referring to potential result or to real ones? Failed compromises are often judged by consequences that were unexpected to the deal makers. I may compromise with my religious neighbors who wish during the COVID pandemic to take part of the public space in my building to build a small and safe place for prayer. The initial outcome is a wonderful friendship. Then other religious people are attracted by the arrangement and move in. In due time, the majority of apartment owners are religious families. The mutual respect associated with the first compromise is now forgotten, and I feel restricted in my own home. When is the outcome of my compromise to be judged? Many compromises are prevented out of fear of such a chain reaction. Good compromises embody safeguards against slippery slope processes that would lead to deterioration, as well as incentive for stability. And even then, that may not be enough. Compromises are to be evaluated not only by the idea involved in them, but also by the participating parties, who should be engaged in a decent compromise. When a compromise significantly affects people who are not represented in the negotiation, we should look more skeptically at its term. But most compromises leave some relevant participant out. The list of unanswered questions is very long. This may be one reason why the morality of compromise is rarely discussed. And then I mentioned to exception Margalit's book on Rosen compromise and Gutmann and Thompson's book on compromise, but this is really quite a rare incident of systematic discussions of compromises. In the next section, I take the discussion one step further and argue that we should settle for good enough compromises. Settling for the perfect compromise may leave us empty-handed. The British psychologist Donald Winnicott introduced the notion of a good enough parent. A key function of a good enough parenting is to provide the essential background to allow for the growing child and his disillusionment with the parents and the world, without destroying the aptitude for life and the ability to accept external or internal reality. Aiming for perfection in both professional and personal lives, Winnicott argues, is destructive. A mother is neither good nor bad, nor the product of illusion, but a separate and independent entity. The good enough mother starts off with an almost complete adaptation to her child's needs, and as time proceeds, she adapts less and less completely, gradually, according to the infant's growing ability to deal with her failure. Her failure to adapt to every need of the child helps her to adapt to external realities. In this respect, a good enough mother is better than the perfect mother. Could the idea behind a good enough mother be adapted to other spheres of life? The London Business School published a guide for good enough leaders. Being good enough means providing the platform for, rather than answers to, the range of meaningful needs people have. It is about creating space for people to grow and develop independently and to create meaning for themselves rather than being told what their meaning should be. This constitutes a shift away from the heroic, egocentric leader, which is achieving success, to a leader that recognizes the needs of his partners, listening and allowing them to voice their concerns. Good enough leaders also show a heightened sensitivity to the fact that their ability is dependent on their team, and listen to the team as if they were themselves part of the leadership team. These qualities are essential in times of uncertainty and disillusions. In the wake of the Glasgow summit, Patricia Espinosa, the United Nations Climate Secretary, protected the agreed upon agreement in the following words. No deal was the worst possible result. Nobody wins. A hold your nose deal, which doesn't fully satisfy everyone but brings us forward, is a good enough compromise. What are the basic features of a good enough compromise? Morality, remembering that one rotten apple spoils the whole barrel. Modesty, giving room to other points of view. Freedom, creating space for people to grow and develop independently, to create meaning for themselves rather than being told what their meaning should be. Inclusiveness, involving the widest possible range of participating parties. And utility, causing the most minimal damage in order to produce the largest set of gains. Were Gabizon's compromises good enough? When one must make a national compromise. In Considerations on Representative Government, John Stuart Mill writes the following. There are parts even of Europe in which different nationalities are so locally integrated that it is not practical for them to be under separate governments. There is no curse open to them but to make a virtue out of necessity and reconcile themselves in living together under equal rights and laws. Territorial national intermingling that makes disentanglement impossible does call for a compromise. Mill's description captures the motivation of liberal nationalists in general and of most of those who promote the idea of a Jewish and democratic state. Namely, a compromise is a second best when the pure solution is impossible. Balancing human aspiration for freedom, recognition, and equality with aspiration for belonging and expressive collective creativity, it vouches for a complex ideological compromise, grounded in a readiness to reconcile one's preferences and desires in order to agree on a livable settlement. Gabizon compromises follow this description. We must look, she argues, for national justifications based on universal moral grounds. This is the only sort of argument which will make sense to the majority of Israelis who prefer not to base their Zionism on religious belief or to those non-Jews who are committed to human rights but not to biblical-based claims. Moreover, such an argument may have the added benefit of encouraging Palestinians to argue in universal terms rather than relying on claims of historical ownership or the holiness of Muslim lands. Locating the argument within the discourse of universal right is therefore the best way to avoid a pointless clash of dogmas that leave no room for dialogue or compromise. The character of Israel as a Jewish nation state, she admits, does generate some tension with the democratic principles of civic equality. Nonetheless, these tensions do not prevent Israel from being a democracy. There are no inherent disagreements. This could be true only if Israel has a stable and large Jewish majority. And yet, this majority must be careful to respect the rights of all its citizens, irrespective of their nationality and religion, recognizing the distinct interests and cultures of the various communities. I believe, she adds, that the Jewish state had a justification when it was established, and that it has such a justification even today, despite the serious violation of welfare and rights of Palestinians in Israel and abroad. I believe it is fundamentally possible to realize the Jewish right to national self-determination without causing or perpetuating lasting harm to the Palestinians if we allow them to create their own nation states where these rights could be realized. I fully admit that preserving the Jewish character of Israel is an attack on the Arab minority. But efforts to preserve this unique character can be justified even if they harm and limit the welfare of the Arab minority and individuals who are members of that minority. The merit of the two-state solution depends on one analysis of the situation. While I'm critical of some of Gabizon's statements, I still believe that this is the least bad compromise possible. Choosing between this compromise and no compromise, I tend to agree with Ruth Gabizon. And while doing so, I applaud Gabizon for not ignoring the harms caused by such a compromise. In this sense, I think that the involved parties involving the two parties could lead to a good enough compromise from which both can benefit. I now move to the Gabizon-Medan compromise. In the spirit of compromise, Gabizon joined Rabbi Yaakov Medan to set a foundation for a new social covenant between religious observant and secular Jews in Israel. The covenant aimed to create a common ground which, while unifying, leaves room for disagreement, creating an operative framework for devising solutions and discouraging a particular side from forcing defeat upon the other. The principles of the covenant reflect the ideological dilemmas experienced by the authors. That, they argue, demonstrate that it is possible to arrive at a single joint proposal without contradicting the tenet of the diverged belief, the Torah and Jewish law on the one hand, and the centrality of the principle of equality, human dignity, and liberty on the other. In this rendering, they write, we assume a reverse approach, beginning with the agreed practical proposal and only subsequently presenting our principles. The best way of addressing fundamental disagreement is to establish a practical framework that is acceptable to all sectors of the Jewish public in Israel through a process of a dialogue. In this manner, the dignity of all groups is upheld with an attendant commitment to protect the beliefs and lifestyles of each, enabling all groups to act in coordinated fashion to promote shared existential goals. The covenant also rejects the introduction of a unilateral change in agreements and argues that changes could be and should be dealt with in political, but not through the courts, in political discussion, but not through the courts. While welcoming the institution of consensual decision-making procedure, Ruth Gabizon argues that we should appeal to the leaders of the Jewish public in Israel to embrace the spirit of the covenant in all full discourse on matters of religion and state. This would be in the interest of a meaningful, peaceful conduct. It's also the call of the hour in view of the disastrous consequences of exacerbating social divide. One can, of course, debate the actual agreements embedded in the government-Medan covenant, as Professor Harael did on some points. But I'm more interested in the structure of the covenant, which reflects Mill's idea of making virtue of necessity. Out of responsibility to the common goal, the continuous existence of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, both sides are stepping forward, giving up some of their preferences and interests in order to reach a solution. Yet, unlike the two-state solution, this solution is not grounded in universal liberal principles. It is grounded on a compromise between a liberal and an illiberal state of mind. If illiberal ideologies are rotten apples, no compromises could be struck. Acknowledging that illiberal ideologies play a significant political role within liberal democratic state forces liberals to find a way to communicate with and, when necessary, accommodate such views. Political necessity thus compels liberals to go a long way toward respecting the needs of members of illiberal cultures. But the process is not reciprocated, as illiberal cultures do not have the theoretical foundation that would allow them to pay genuine respect to liberal ones. The result is an asymmetric process whereby liberal compromise for principles reasons, while illiberals endure liberal cultures merely out of necessity, as their own principle leave no room for a more fundamental type of concession. The two parties thus have different motivation to enter into an agreement. While its endorsement by liberal is grounded in respect for the choices others make, its endorsement by illiberal culture is grounded merely in the argument of lesser evil. As the compromise from the point of view of the illiberal community is not even a modus vivendi based on live and let live, but a conditional one, it is more likely to be violated. For that reason, the Gabizon-Meidan compromise, if it would have been enacted, could have been much less stable and probably less than good enough, as it violates the three of the 5 principles mentioned earlier. We must, root rights, find ways of living together. This is the role of political dialogue, and for that reason, we should make sure not to castrate politics. It is therefore not surprising that she preached for judicial restraint. Forging a dynamic balance resulting from citizens exercising the right to voice their opinion, organize, and vote will create a relatively wide space for political and social struggle and conflicts, and then maybe arriving to some agreements. It is incumbent then on all citizens to fight for their own beliefs and interests, but they must also recognize the legitimacy of decisions that have been made, even if these do not match their own beliefs. The discourse on right, roots argue, is not the appropriate tool for settling key constitutional and political issues. In the light of the fact that it takes recourse to rigid principles that impair the flexibility needed to effectively reach workable compromises that allow us to manage controversy and conflict. The way of law must be one, while value system and lifestyle will remain different and varied, each in its own way. The profound disagreement between value systems may be explored in greater depth and even expanded through genuine method of elucidation, but without the need to defeat and dominate the other side. I'm not here to defend or criticize any of Gabizon's specific arguments. Others will probably do it better than me, but to defend the spirit of compromise she adhered to. I can only admire her dedication to this reflective, mostly frustrating, ongoing process. We cannot legislate for the unknown consequences, writes Isaiah Berlin. The possibility of a final solution turns out to be an illusion, and a very dangerous one. Utopias have their value. Nothing so wonderfully expands the imaginative horizons of human potentialities. But as guides to conduct, they can prove literally fatal. In this spirit, I advise us to pay more theoretical attention to the notion of compromises in general and good enough compromises in particular, and nurture the compromising mindset as part of our moral education. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tamir, for this very illuminating speech on the theory of compromise and also on the very practical difficulties which we face in Israel in trying to reach a compromise on the difficult issues which we confront. And also, thank you for relating your speech to the work of Professor Gabizon, her great work, and also the difficulties inherent in some of her compromises. Our next speaker will be Professor Michael Wólzer. Unfortunately, he couldn't come here and his speech will be is recorded and will be shown in a few minutes. Professor Wולצר is a professor emeritus of social science in the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He is a great scholar, author, and a lecturer. Wולtzer's addressed a wide variety of topics in political theory and moral philosophy. His books include Just and Unjust Wars, Spheres of Justice, The Company of Critics, Thick and Thin, Moral Argument at Home and Abroad, On Toleration, and Politics and Passion. His books and essays had a huge influence both on political thought and on the issues of morality in the context of politics. Professor Wולtzer also served as a co-editor of Dissent, now in its 64th year. His articles and interviews appear frequently in the world's foremost newspapers and journals. He is a personality of immense impact in the field of politics and, as I say, morality in politics, and we all look forward to his speech. Please. I hope you can somehow broadcast
I'm
it.
sorry that I can't be with you today, but I'm grateful that the tech people in Princeton and in Jerusalem have made it possible for me to say something about Ruth and liberal nationalism. Yuli will have more and better to say. I'm sorry again that I'm not able to listen to her talk. Ruth Gavizon was a political friend, an ideological friend, and a friend. We would meet whenever my wife and I were in Israel or she was in or near Princeton. We would usually have dinner and talk about politics. She did most of the talking. I was a good listener. But she also read anything I wrote on subjects that interested her. She was a good reader. She was committed to the idea of a Jewish nation state that would also be liberal and democratic. And she defended that idea vigorously in Israel, and I supported that idea as best I could from outside. We talked a lot about all the adjectives: Jewish, liberal, democratic. Ruth's close friend, David Myers, has written a moving tribute to her in the Jewish Forward, in which he describes her move to the right during the last 2 decades of her life, starting perhaps with her support of the citizenship law in 2003. She focused on the adjective Jewish, he writes, and left democratic behind. Their mutual affection survived what was a deep political disagreement. I would also have disagreed with Ruth in 2003, though I don't remember a conversation about the liberalism law. Her position when we talked or when I listened did not seem so forgetful of the values of liberalism and democracy. But she was very strongly opposed to liberal and left cosmopolitanism, and then to the idea that Israel should be not a Jewish state, but a state of all its citizens. What I would like to do today is to defend a version of that opposition, a version that Ruth seemed sympathetic to when we were together, though perhaps less so, I can't say, when she was engaged in her Israeli battles. The argument has to do with the rights of the majority. Ruth spent much of her life defending the rights of minorities, and I do the same thing quite naturally, since I am a member of one of America's smallest minorities. But I also believe in majority rights, or at least when they're not legally established, legally enforced, So let me explain what that means with some American stories. I don't mean to suggest analogies with Israel, at least not immediately. I just want to open a window on some practices that are rarely discussed. I dedicate the stories to Ruth. She would have liked them. First story. I grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania, a steel town then, with a population of about 70,000, including roughly 2,000 Jews. After the Steelworkers Union came to town, the Jews prospered. The workers were mostly from Eastern Europe, entirely conventional anti-Semites, who nonetheless preferred Jewish merchants and Jewish doctors to the Yankees, the unfamiliar Protestant elite. Each year in mid-December, the city erected a creche on the town commons. And each year there were protests in the name of the separation of church and state. A tiny group of self-described atheists protested, but not the Jews. We were quiet for prudential reasons, obviously, but also because we thought, or some of us thought, that after all, the town was 95% Christian. So why shouldn't the members of that large majority be able to express their religious culture in public space? The creche didn't hurt us. It didn't violate our rights. I like to say that we tolerated it. Second story. In the public schools in my town and across the country in the 1940s and 50s, every day began with the Pledge of Allegiance and the Lord's Prayer. The pledge had recently been amended to include the phrase, "a republic under God." My parents told me to stand, say the pledge, and remain silent during the recitation of the prayer. That's what I did, and I don't think I've ever felt so firmly Jewish as when I stood silently every morning. Both the pledge and the prayer are gone now, out of respect, it said, for the rights or the dignity of minorities, including atheists who don't believe in a republic under God. I'm not sure that minorities are better off. And some members of the American majority definitely feel deprived. Just before Christmas in those years, the music teacher would lead us all in singing Christmas carols. Once again, I was silent. But I recently read an account of one Jewish mother who didn't insist on silence. She told her daughter to sing Silent Night, Holy Night, if she liked the music. If Silent Night undermines her Jewishness, the mother said, then I haven't done my job. She was more than ready to tolerate Christian majoritarianism in the public schools. Today, in those same schools, you cannot sing Christmas carols without also singing Hanukkah songs, and I think other songs. And I don't believe this is a great gain for religious pluralism. It trivializes all the music, and it probably leads many Jewish mothers and fathers to think that they don't have to do their job. Now, I want to say very clearly that I would oppose any law that required a creche on the town common or the recitation of Christian prayers in the public schools. That would be a deliberate affront to the Jewish and now the Muslim minorities and the atheists too. But what happens informally, that I think is easy to live with. As long as, and this is important, the civil rights of the minorities are well established and there is no social or economic discrimination against them. I don't mean so long as minorities are tolerated. George Washington settled the issue of toleration in the United States when he told the Jewish congregation of Newport, Rhode Island in 1790 that, quote, "It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it is by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoys the exercise of their inherent natural rights." Once we Jews are enjoying our inherent natural rights, we can indulge the majority's claim to an unequal role in the public culture. That's not their inherent natural right, but it's rather a more informal right that comes along with democratic success. Now, some of you might say these are trivial examples, but they are the kinds of examples that Ruth often talked about, symbols of majoritarianism. But let's consider a hard case, hard for me, probably for you, immigration. The United States is an immigrant society, more ethnically and racially diverse than almost any other, so perhaps not a useful model. But if there was a severe anti-Christian persecution somewhere in the world, I would think it justifiable for the American government to make a special effort to rescue the persecuted Christians, to bring them in, and maybe even set them on a fast road to citizenship. American Jews could tolerate that, but only so long as there was a regular and ordinary immigration and naturalization policy open to refugees and asylum seekers without regard to religion or anything else. I don't doubt that if angry, fearful, resentful, white Christian nationalists came to power in the United States, which isn't impossible, we Jews might have to deal with examples of majoritarian assertiveness that we would not be inclined to tolerate. Though prudence might, I hope not, prudence might require us to be silent. Insecure majorities are the most dangerous. Think of America in the 1840s, when the Anglo-Protestant majority was suddenly confronted, threatened, some of its members thought, by a sharp increase in the number of Irish Catholics. The result was the appearance and startling growth of the Know-Nothing Party, representing an Anglo-Protestant nationalism and aiming to cut off immigration or to keep the immigrants from becoming citizens. Over time, in part because they were white, the inherent natural rights of Irish Americans were recognized, and they in turn learned to tolerate aspects of Anglo-Protestant culture. So here is a definition of liberal nationalism, drawing upon American history and politics. We can say that a country is liberally nationalist if the national majority recognizes the inherent natural rights, the human rights of minority citizens, and if those citizens feel sufficiently secure in their possession of those rights that they are willing to tolerate the majority's predominant role, not exclusive role, in shaping the country's public life. Frightened or paranoid majorities, by contrast, make for an illiberal nationalism. Ruth imagined an Israel that would meet this definition, in which the Arab or Palestinian minority would be able to tolerate the symbols of Jewish majoritarianism. This was Green Line Israel with improvements, but not Israel of the occupation and the settler movement, and certainly not greater Israel, where the rule of a radically insecure, if not non-existent, Jewish majority couldn't be either liberal or democratic. There are many things Ruth wrote in 2016 that majorities cannot do. I'm the last person to deny that. Moreover, she said, there are many things that majorities may have the power to do, but that they should not do for moral as well as political and prudential reasons. I want to say, respectfully and carefully, since I'm not an Israeli citizen, that there are many things that Jews in Israel have the power to do but shouldn't do that they are doing today. It's important to acknowledge majority wrongs before talking about majority rights. Here is Ruth again. No state is permitted to violate the human rights of its inhabitants. I take that to mean both its citizens and its subjects. And Ruth goes on, this principle does not become less obligatory if the purpose of the infringement is the preservation of the Jewish character of the state. Human rights set the standard. But Ruth did have a restricted view of human rights. Thus, the sentence that follows the one I just quoted, not every policy that individuals or minorities dislike or object to amounts to a violation of their rights. If rights covered all the things that individuals or groups might object to, I think this is what Ruth meant. It is hard to see what democracy, the rule of the majority, would amount to. This is an argument that I've also made, though in American, not Israeli circumstances. The more expansive our understanding of human rights, the more limited the room for democratic decision-making. Given a list of human rights like the one in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, it will follow inevitably that legal interpretation will replace legislative deliberation. Rights will dominate policy. There is a precedent in Jewish history for this disestablishment of the legislature, which also provides a nice example of the ways in which Jewish history should not determine the character of the Jewish state. If you try to imagine the regime of a biblical monarchy, or of the Babylonian exilarch, or of an autonomous or semi-autonomous kahal in the Middle Ages, what is missing in every case is an assembly that deliberates about policy. Since God is the lawgiver, and since his law is eternal, and since amendment is barred, almost all the work of government consists of judges interpreting the law and kings or elders or the good men of the town enforcing it. Of course, interpreting the law is often a way of making new law, but it isn't a democratic way. Today, human rights stand in for divine law, and that is, I think, a gain for humanity. But beware of judges who claim the powers of our ancient sages. But now I have to backtrack quickly and acknowledge the importance of the work of judges in democratic societies. The one critical thing that majorities cannot do is to undermine or override democracy itself. They cannot deny or weaken the rights that make democratic politics possible, crucially the right of opposition and all the rights that phrase encompasses: to assemble and to speak and to write, to publish, to agitate, and to vote freely without legal constraint. The political minority must always have an open path along which it can work to turn itself into a political majority. And the courts must keep that path open. It's also important to protect the rights of what the United States Supreme Court calls discrete and insular minorities, which I take to mean permanent religious, racial, or ethnic minorities, to make sure that they are able to participate freely and equally in democratic politics. The court, the US court, rightly gave itself a special role in looking after minorities of that sort. Today, in the United States, we have an activist court that doesn't hesitate to overrule legislative efforts by the federal government to use state power to reduce inequality. One might say that it's a court that finds the American version of social democracy unconstitutional. But this same court refuses to interfere in efforts by the 50 states, or rather by the states ruled by Republicans, to curtail voting rights. That gets the work of judges, as I understand it, and I think as Ruth understood it, exactly backwards. American Jews are a discrete and insular minority. We are therefore constitutionally protected, and so far at least, the protection is effective. So I do not protest when a new session of the US Congress is opened in the name of Jesus Christ, or when government offices are closed on Christmas Day. America is a Christian country, though no law says so. So long as majority rights are exercised informally, I can even happily tolerate them. But I do worry when Christian Americans, or more accurately, some white Christian Americans, claim fearfully that their America is being taken away from them, that Muslim and Mexican immigration, promoted, some say, by the Jews, threatens their way of life. Insecure majorities, as I've already said, are dangerous. When the defense of majority rights requires religious discrimination among potential immigrants, the denial of the right of asylum, and illegal surveillance of minority populations, then I am not tolerant. And I like to think that Ruth, were she with me in America, would join me in saying no to all that. What she would say and what you should say in Israel right now, I leave that to you to figure out. Thank you for giving me the chance to talk to you today.
Hello, everybody. Dear Gavizon family, dear David Harael, President of the Academy, former President Menachem Yaari, Shai Lavi, Head of Van Leer, dear colleagues and friends, I'm honored and delighted to open the second session of the conference dedicated to the blessed memory of Ruth Gavizon. Ruth Gavizon was an intellectual giant who left an indelible mark on our legal and intellectual life. We mourn her untimely loss. We were all blessed with her membership at our academy, to which she contributed immensely. And I would like to mention one contribution so relevant to the current discussion. In 2017, following the agreement with the Royal Society, we decided to hold a joint conference in Jerusalem on privacy and technology. It was a fantastic conference exposing the new dangers
to privacy and the need to balance anew its limits. Ruthie, who wrote the Yale Law Journal seminal article on privacy in 1980, gave the opening lecture. She spoke about privacy and anonymity. She argued that the main protector of one's privacy is and has always been anonymity. This is the reason why the critical functions of privacy are more or less maintained today, despite the great changes in technologies that facilitate a never-ending quest after more ways of acquiring, sorting, processing, and disseminating information, and of defeating them. Yet, she continued, this analysis highlights the fact that modern life does indeed challenge in new ways the goals and values that privacy protects and reveals important insights about the nature of privacy and the reasons its universal and ancient importance to individuals and society has been so elusive. End of Ruthie's lecture summary. I'm sure Ruthie would have been proud and enthusiastic with the two speakers this afternoon who will relate to her pioneering scholarship, Anita Ellen and Niva Elkin-Koren. Anita Ellen is the first speaker, and she'll participate through Zoom. Anita Ellen is the Henry R. Silberman Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, where she was Vice Provost for faculty till 2020. A graduate of Harvard Law School with a PhD in philosophy from the University of Michigan, Professor Ellen is an expert on privacy and data protection law, bioethics, and public philosophy. Currently, she is chair of the board of Electronic Privacy Information Center in Washington. In 2014, she received a Lifetime Achievement Award from this center for her pioneering privacy scholarship and advocacy. And for the same accomplishment, she was awarded honorary doctorates from Tilburg University and the College of Worcester in the United States. Professor Ellen was president of the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association, the first African-American woman in history to be so named. And just today, we got the wonderful message that Anita is to receive the Philip L. Quinn Prize, the American Philosophical Association's highest honor. Congratulations, Anita. We are proud to have you with us and to hear you speaking about Gavison's privacy prescription. Was it the cure? Please.
Good afternoon. I'm honored to have been asked to speak about the privacy-related scholarship of the late Ruth Gavison. I'm honored because I owe her a debt that perhaps this brief tribute today can help to repay. Gavison's work profoundly impacted me at the start of my career. It set me on a path to becoming a lifelong philosopher of privacy and privacy lawyer. I only met Gavison once, and that was about 5 years ago. But I'm very glad that I had a chance to spend some time with her in Tel Aviv before she passed on. I understand that Gavison was a notable public figure in Israel, sometimes controversial. She was not a passive armchair philosopher. She engaged real-world issues of a unique and complex society. I've only been to Israel 3 times, and I don't pretend to understand your complex politics. They do interest me, though. Indeed, I read with special interest the sections of the famous Ruth Davidson Yaakov Goldman proposals respecting the Sabbath. You see, I became interested in the right to privacy when I was a graduate student in philosophy after reading a 1972 U.S. Supreme Court decision, Wisconsin versus Yoder. It was about whether a religious minority sect had the right to remove their children from public schools at the age of 13 in defiance of state law. Our Supreme Court said yes, the Amish could preserve their culture and their way of life by removing their children from school at age 13. Now, I disagreed because I think every child should have an education through age 18. And I began to reflect on certain questions that I know deeply concerned Ruth Davidson. What is the proper boundary between the state and the private realm of religious choice? And to what extent ought religious preferences to be respected, whatever they may do to burden others who don't share those preferences? I was asked to speak today about Davidson's published contributions to privacy law. Those contributions feature 4 law review articles in English. I will briefly describe them and say something about their significance. A general feature of her work is insistence upon analytical clarity combined with a degree of practical as well as theoretical purpose. The earliest article in English I want to talk about today is one that she published in 1977 in the Israel Law Review. It was entitled, "Should We Have a General Right to Privacy in Israel?" The article begins with a speculation that the emerging academic and legal interest privacy has mounted is due to the growth of mass media and computing technologies. And it's clear at that point that Davidson was not the least bit in those developments. She saw the main purpose of her article as explaining and distinguishing between questions of scope and questions of form in all discussions of law reform. Her discussion of privacy, she said, is simply an application of this distinction. With only a mild interest in privacy and technology, Davidson was philosophically interested in the design of a legal system and a rule of law for the young nation of Israel. In an analytical style that reflected her Oxford DPhil education, she was, by the way, a student of the famous H.L.A. Hart, she argued that there are 4 different methods of providing legal protection for privacy. She called them the adjustment approach, the piecemeal approach, the general remedy approach, and the declaration of right approach. With the adjustment approach, no new causes of action for privacy violations are created. Instead, existing causes of action are adjusted to cover all privacy violations that are deemed desirable. The piecemeal approach calls for the creation of new causes of action in order to provide remedies for violations that are currently not covered. This seems, by the way, to describe what happened in the United States with tort law in the early part of the 20th century. The general remedy approach, which may be reflected in the EU's General Data Protection Directive, involves the creation of a new general violation of privacy and covers all invasions of privacy that are deemed desirable to impose liability upon. The last approach, the declaration of right approach, obtains where it's declared that every person has the right to privacy, but no causes of action are specified or created at that moment. Now, Davidson argued that in the context of the Israeli system, the ideal approach would be one that combined the general remedy and a declaration of rights approaches. Because the value of privacy has only become a concern more recently, she argued, the general declaration's primary benefit would be to educate the public. After the novelty of privacy has been embraced through declaration, then, she said, a general remedy approach is best to identify what violations of privacy are worth protecting by law. In defending this perspective, she fends off criticisms that privacy is not a useful general concept at all, that privacy rights should be recognized as redundant and even misleading. She rejected all of those kinds of claims. Focusing on post-World War II human rights documents and constitutional and common law remedies found in the West, I don't think her 1977 article in any way anticipated the current legal terrain of Israel's data protection laws, featuring the Protection of Privacy Law 5141-1981, the Privacy Law, and the regulation promulgated under it, the Basic Law, Human Dignity and Liberty, or the guidelines of the Israeli regulator, the Privacy Protection Authority. None of that was anticipated by Gavson, although I do think it might count as sort of the general law that would come after the declarative law. Yet, because many jurisdictions still struggle with how best to protect privacy interests through law, local, national, special purpose, omnibus, and so on, Gaveson's 1977 article holds conceptual and practical value. Gaveson is best known in the United States as the author of a seminal article in the prestigious Yale Law Review in 1980 called Privacy and the Limits of Law. I entered law school at Harvard in 1981, and when I told Professor Martha Minow that I was interested in privacy, she immediately called the article to my attention, and I eagerly read it. It was the clearest attempt I'd ever seen to define privacy in relation to law. Gaveson won me over for the most part. Let me place the article in context. Much of the earliest philosophical work respecting privacy focused on how precisely to define privacy to escape confusion, ambiguity in usage, and vagueness. What does the term denote and connote? What in broader senses does it mean? Is it a value or a state of affairs? How, if at all, should privacy be used in ethics, policy, and law? Is the term being used appropriately in the law courts? Of course, philosophers also engaged in theorizing about the ethical and practical value of privacy in the years before Gaveson. Why is that important? Why is privacy important? What good does it do, and what are its downsides and risks, philosophers ask? Taking a stand on the value of privacy seemed to presuppose a definitional perspective about what is or should be talked about under the rubric of privacy. Philosophers presumed some sort of definitional analysis was necessary to rein in privacy usage, wary that both definitions and methodologies and goals of definition were themselves philosophically divergent and contestable. Enter Gaveson. According to Gaveson, it is possible to provide a neutral and coherent philosophical definition of privacy. Privacy, she argued, is best defined as limitations on others' access to an individual. This simple definition can be broken down into three interrelated but interdependent component parts. One, limited information about the individual, or secrecy. Two, limited attention paid to the individual, anonymity. And three, limited physical access to the person, as in solitude. Additionally, the possession of privacy can occur in degrees, not an all or none kind of a concept. You can be more or less experiencing solitude, more or less experiencing anonymity. Privacy is about degrees of limited access to the person. Gaveson rejected several popular definitions of privacy. Americans Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis had characterized privacy in a landmark 1890 article as being let alone. In contrast, Gaveson argued that privacy should not be defined as being let alone because such a definition covers almost every complaint one could imagine. Privacy also should not be confused with non-interference with from state action, with liberty from state action. Issues involving state interference in personal decisions, she said, is better characterized as liberty of action rather than privacy. This means that concerns about freedom of access to, for example, contraception and abortion should be distinguished from concerns about privacy proper, solitude, anonymity, and secrecy. This is where I parted ways with Gaveson, a point I will come back to. Gaveson argued that the value of privacy is instrumental. The viability of this approach is contingent upon the importance of goals promoted by privacy and the strength of the link between privacy and such goals. She thought it possible to conceptually link privacy with goals such as the development of trust and friendship, as well as the ability to distinguish one's own thoughts and feelings from another's. Privacy promotes relaxation, which is important for intimacy and mental health. Privacy also enhances liberty by shielding individuals from censorship, pressures to conform, and criticism. Individuals desire to avoid public failure, and privacy allows for private experimentation, prior to revealing something new about oneself to the public. In terms of autonomy, privacy is crucial because it permits individuals to deviate from societal norms in isolation or with a group of like-minded individuals, such as the Amish departing from the norm of America's Judeo-Christian majority. Finally, privacy encourages healthy personal relationships by allowing individuals to control and edit their image to others. Now, this analysis of privacy can also be extrapolated to society at large. Privacy fosters the moral autonomy that democracy itself requires. Despite the benefits of privacy, Gaveston felt that the law is limited in its capacity to protect and provide such privacy. That's because, for example, once private information is made public, monetary damages in a lawsuit cannot undo the harm by public disclosure. Additionally, the publicity involved in a legal trial may only serve to further publicize the information that was intended to be private and further bruise and offend and wound the person bringing a lawsuit. Legal protection of privacy is also constrained by the law's strong commitment to interest in freedom of speech, which necessitates diminutions of privacy, a topic that Gaveston took up in her South Carolina article, which I'll just mention in a few minutes. Gaveston thought her article and her analysis was good medicine for curing the state of confusion and uncertainty in the jurisprudence of privacy at the time that she wrote. But the perception that privacy is a messy, vague, ambiguous concept inside and outside of the law is still heard today. The medicine didn't cure the problem. Her analysis, though, was embraced by many, including me, who I adopted a restricted access theory similar to hers when I adopted such a theory at all. But most people declined to accept her prescription for how to cure privacy ills. Still, they admired her analytical chops. Now, Gaveston published a significant article in American Law Review in 1992, the South Carolina Law Review. The article was called Too Early for a Requiem, Warren and Brandeis Were Right on Privacy versus Free Speech. So she mentioned in the Yale article that privacy and free speech were often in conflict. In the South Carolina article, she lays that out in some detail, arguing that the 1890 article by Warren and Brandeis contained a useful framework for understanding how we can have both a right to privacy and rights of free speech. In some ways, I was puzzled, like, why would Ruth Gaveston, an Israeli, end up publishing an article in the South Carolina Law Review? I think the answer is that Ferdinand Schoeman, who was a professor at South Carolina, was the editor of the first major anthology of privacy papers, a book of still great value today called The Philosophical Dimensions of Privacy. And in that anthology was an excerpt of Gaveston's Yale article. I'm sure that admiration for Gaveston led Ferdinand Schoeman to invite her to South Carolina, and probably that invitation to South Carolina resulted in her contributing a talk that she gave to the South Carolina Law Review. Now, despite the criticism that Warren and Brandeis deserve, because being let alone is not an adequate definition of privacy, their article has been very influential in the free speech realm as well as in the privacy realm, sparking America's privacy tort revolution. And the way they tried to reconcile free speech and privacy, Gaveston argued, is very effective and really does do a great job of trying to reconcile some of the problems around both first and second order justifications of privacy and free speech that have been offered by theorists. At the first order level, free speech and privacy don't always conflict. For example, the marketplace of ideas rationale for free speech is not necessarily incompatible with privacy protections because privacy laws often address speech that's not truthful and would have little place in such a marketplace. But moving to a second order level, victims of privacy violations still deserve our sympathy for having to suffer a cost for having the press freely publish their information, but their pain should be construed as an inevitable cost of freedom that could be minimized as much as possible, though not eliminated. So though flawed in some ways, according to Gaveston, Warren and Brandeis' essay on privacy considered both the benefits of privacy and free speech acknowledging some second-order arguments, and held that free speech should triumph over privacy in cases of doubt. The final article I want to mention that established Gaveston's reputation in the US is one she published a dozen years after the first, also in 1992, like the South Carolina article, this one though in the prestigious Stanford Law Review. It was called Feminism and the Public-Private Distinction. I was a student when Gaveston published the Yale article in 1980. By the time the Stanford article came out in 1992, I was no longer a law student, but a law professor with tenure in the faculty of Georgetown University Law Center and a visiting professor at Harvard Law School. 4 years before Gaveston's Stanford article in 1988, I had published a book called Uneasy Access: Privacy for Women in a Free Society. Although, oddly, Gaveston does not cite my assessment of her work in my 1988 book. In her otherwise very well-researched Stanford Law Review article, I can be flattered that she repeats many of my central points and arguments about the feminist critique of privacy in her article. Recently, her Stanford article begins, some feminist scholars have become critical of the public-private distinction. The internal challenge to privacy holds that the public-private distinction is problematic because it creates the mistaken belief that the public and the private realms are givens, somehow part of nature, instead of products of human determination. Conversely, the external challenge, the external critique of privacy, questions whether there is any useful way to draw distinctions between public and private. Criticisms include that the public-private dichotomy is sufficiently indeterminate, that the use of such terms are merely rationalizations for previously made decisions, no behaviors are truly self-regarding, private choices are not free from societal constraints, and that the personal is political. Of course, the feminist critique is most famous for the notion that the personal is political. Gaveston lays out all of these concerns as well or better than anyone, and joins me in concluding that women benefit from conditions of genuine privacy and private choice, but they must be free from the constraints of gender inequality. As I put it in my book, women have had too much of the wrong kinds of privacy. They need less time cabinet home in the kitchen with caretaking duties and more time for opportunities for exercising their independent judgment, their choice, and for repose. Once again, Gaveston insists upon the need for a clarity that she believes comes with the methods of analytic philosophy. She concluded the piece by saying, "So I write this as an invitation to do what must be done if we are not to talk forever past each other, to unpack the claims, distinguishing between those that are empirical, social, and causal, and those which relate to visions of ideal worlds. We must argue about the truth or adequacy of first and the details and feasibility of the second." Finally, she said, we must make claims about the relationships between language, conceptions, social reality, and social change, less elusive, more intelligible, and more accessible to reasoned judgment. Now, just before that very brilliant ending, Gaveston displayed what she understands we must not let theoretical squabbles about reform do. We must not allow theoretical squabbles to impede reform. Quote, "When we remember the urgent social problems that call for resolution, it is more than just frustrating to be stuck in the realm of theoretical polemics." Now, I've come to be very greatly appreciative of Gaveston's words about not being stuck in the realm of theoretical polemics at the expense of the resolution of urgent social problems. In fact, I've completely abandoned analytical prescriptive definition as an approach to explaining privacy. Looking at privacy through the lens of my African-American race, I now embrace what I call critical definitional facilitation. And this too, I believe it's inspired by Gaveston, because just as she was very concerned about what Israel needed by way of privacy, I'm very concerned about what America and my people need by way of privacy. I wish Gaveston were here today to tell me if my prescription is a fresh bottle of medicine to effect a cure for the momentous privacy ills that concern us all. I do present my approach in a forthcoming article in the Oxford Handbook of Applied Philosophy of Language, of which I'll give you now a very brief sample before I conclude. In my article, I talk about how the discourses of privacy are political through and through, and I think Gaveston appreciated that point. There can be no politically neutral definitional analysis of privacy packaged for application to practical problems. The aim of philosophers should be to articulate what is at stake in privacy discourses, first of all, and then to seek the definitional clarity needed to do the work of making deep normative values, such as freedom and anti-subordination, real. And if I part with ways with Gaveston, I think that Gaveston appreciated the importance of the normative and the political, but I think she maybe overemphasized the importance of starting first with the theoretical, the abstract, and the conceptual. So philosophers have thought they should define the meaning of privacy first and then explain its value. But actually, I argue, we should be explaining the value of the things that people call privacy first, and then offer analytical clarification as to the terms that are needed to get the practical work done. The shift from prescriptive meaning to practical significance is a shift from linguistic analysis merely to political analysis that includes linguistic analysis. One source of great concern is the way in which people of color in the United States are subjected to extraordinary degrees of profiling and surveillance. African Americans believe that we lack the privacy we deserve merely because of our race, our low social status, the need for public services, and residence in urban communities. The use of error-prone facial recognition and unfair algorithms are described as privacy problems by African Americans. We could take this whole discussion into a different context, into China, for example, and focus on how China treats the Uyghurs, the Muslim minority, who are subjected to extremes of surveillance as a mechanism of social control and exclusion. What if the philosophy of privacy began here with the plight of Blacks and Uyghurs, and then moved to a definition of privacy in service of justice? We would begin this approach by characterizing why it matters if minorities are surveilled by government for purposes of repression. I've argued that privacy goods are extremely important and worthy of characterization as foundational goods of the sort we might view as a basis of fundamental rights, natural rights, and human rights. A strong way to characterize the value of the many forms of privacy that we could enjoy is to say that privacy is a tool of anti-subordination, standing in opposition to the horrors, for example, of chattel slavery. This characterization must be reconciled with the feminist critique of privacy, which has emphasized that women have been harmed when privacy notions support unfettered domination of women's lives by husbands and fathers, and with the sense that privacy is an elitist notion conferring privileges on those who can afford the houses, encryption, and social standing that confers practical privacy. For privacies to be tools of anti-subordination, they must be possessed by all, including those who subsist in the lowest economic classes, castes, and minority groups. After a rich characterization of why and how the material conditions people are seeking through the discourses of privacy matter, the new approach that I'm advocating would move to stipulate definitions that capture those concerns. As a group, Blacks' privacy concerns are nuanced and subject to change, of course. The privacy that Blacks are complaining about today is freedom from pervasive, selective, accusatory, anxiety-producing, and chilling observation, harassment, and violence by officials. There's a classic physical information privacy concerns of the sort that Gaveston discussed. We talk about them today in terms of the panopticon society, where the privacy at stake is amenable to definition as restricted access to people and information about them, just as Ruth Gaveston suggested many years ago. Also of concern to Blacks today is freedom from interference with private life, data privacy on social media platforms, and privacy in healthcare and at work. Some might be tempted to argue in the mode of Gaveston's early work that African Americans who think that privacy so expansively can be defined are confused about the proper definition of privacy. But since it's the political problem that is the practical problem, philosophers should understand their role as helping to characterize Blacks' privacy claims on their own terms as privacy claims. We do this by linking what they are saying to what is otherwise said about privacy to the language of privacy overall. When definitional prescription, of which Ruth Gavson was a pioneer, is replaced by definitional facilitation, at least at the start, philosophers foreground practical politics, methodologically legitimating urgent concerns about bodily integrity and government interference, commonly framed as privacy concerns because of their deep relationship to personhood, personality, and the intimacies that make us more fit for social roles and the responsibilities of citizenship. Few people on the planet have contributed more to our understanding of privacy than Ruth Gavson. I thank her for being an inspiration, a mentor, and a friend. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Ellen, for the wonderful and thoughtful lecture that exposed Ruth Gaveson's scholarship, the intricacies of privacy, and the large, deep impact that she had on this subject till now. And now, I'm happy to introduce Professor Niva Elkin-Koren, our second speaker. Niva is a professor of law at Tel Aviv University Faculty of Law. She received her LLB from Tel Aviv University, LLM from Harvard Law School, and SJD from Stanford Law School. Professor Elkin-Koren studies the intersection between law and information technology, focusing on intellectual property, governance by AI, and governance of AI. She's a member of the Academic Management Committee of Tel Aviv University Center for Artificial Intelligence and Data Science, and a faculty associate at the Beckman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. She was the founding director of the Center for Cyber Law and Policy and of the Haifa Center for Law and Technology at Haifa. And at Haifa, she served also as Dean of the Faculty of Law. Niva Elkin-Koren is the chair of the Scientific Advisory Council of the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society and a board member of the Scientific Advisory Board at the Munich IP Law Center, Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition. We are very proud that you are representing us along the world. It's wonderful, and we are proud to have you with us and to hear you speaking about privacy as bureaucracy. Please, Niva.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be here, and I salute the organizers for putting the two of us together in the same panel, because as you will see in a few moments, we disagree on many issues, and I think that maybe that would be an interesting conversation that we could develop during the Q&As. Anyone who studies the law of privacy today may well feel a sense of uneasiness. There are popular demands for increased protection of privacy, discussions of new threats to privacy, and intensified interest in the relationship between privacy and other values such as liberty, anonymity, and mental health. These demands have generated a variety of legal responses. This short quote sounds very much like 2021. The data economy has brought struggles over privacy to the forefront of our social and political debates, leading to various legal reforms around the world. But in fact, this is the opening paragraph in this seminal 1980 article that was published by Professor Ruth Gavison at the Yale Law Journal. The paper intended to tackle an ongoing controversy among privacy scholars who have argued that privacy rhetoric is actually misleading. What is privacy? Well, there are many answers to this question. Privacy, as we've heard, is secrecy, the ability to keep information about me from others. Privacy, the right to be left alone. Privacy is a right to control information about me, but also to control the space, the physical space around me. My house is my home. My home is my castle, as we say. So there is fundamental disagreement about what privacy is, but the question is also, does it matter? Many people argue that rather than focusing on what privacy is and looking for a comprehensive definition of privacy, we ought to actually focus on the interests and values that my privacy may involve, and such as we've heard in the previous talk, like discrimination, inequality, or liberty and manipulation. Professor Gavison disagreed with this approach. Back in the 80s, she has already seen the need to develop a distinct and coherent definition of privacy that indeed thought to address the challenges raised by privacy by introducing an analytic framework of privacy as access. More than 40 years have passed. The world has changed dramatically. We live in times of great transformation. Societies in liberal democracies are no longer able to reach an agreement on the fundamental tenets of liberty. And I think that we've received a taste of this in the previous lecture. Identity politics and skepticism over justice in the existing social order intensify the declining trust in governments. The global pandemic has further deepened social and political divides, reshuffling in some cases some old political boundaries between what is considered left and right. And in the context of our current discussion, there is also major technological transformation. Technology, too, has fundamentally transformed our lives. Artificial intelligence and machine learning systems are increasingly deployed to govern systems that influence our lives, from smart cities to smart homes to automated cars to personalized medicine. Data is sometimes called the new oil of this economy, is essential for generating all of these systems. Data-driven innovation involves collecting the data, processing it, refining the data, often through some of the products and services that we are providing, the smart home, the autonomous cars, the models that predict climate change, the new ways of diagnosing disease. A lot of data is necessary for that, what we call big data, large volumes of data, data that is large at various dimensions, such as volume and the velocity, namely the ways in which it is being refreshed on an ongoing basis, the variety, the types of data that is being collected and used, and the veracity, the way in which we can verify the accuracy of that data. Data is also closely linked to business models and to what is now called surveillance capitalism, this famous book by Shoshana Zuboff. Personal data is being extracted from the digital trail that we all leave as we use all these digital services when we drive our kids to school, navigating with Waze, when we post content on Facebook and TikTok, when we purchase things online, when we are banking, when we are exchanging information. The digital economy, which offers all these services for free, is often described as treating us, the data subjects, as the product that is then being sold to third parties. Now, the question is whether this article from the 80s is still relevant today. I believe that despite the major transformation, the basic insights of Professor Gabizon from the 80s still shine. Indeed, misconceptions of privacy and personal data have led to the emergence of a legal regime which have turned personal privacy into a futile bureaucracy. In the short time that I have today, I'd like to briefly describe how the current legal regime is treating privacy and why I believe that Gabizon's approach might help us think of it differently. And so the legal regime which protects privacy in data nowadays basically reflect two competing approaches and actually two competing ideologies. One is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation that is common, that was introduced in the European Union and is actually reflecting the perception that data privacy is a fundamental right. It's a fundamental right to make choices regarding personal information about us. The GDPR is actually focusing on choice. It introduced, as you can see on the right, a set of rights that are supposed to enable people to make choices related to their personal data that is wildly or expensively defined as any identifiable information. The basic principle of privacy and data protection is consent. Consent is necessary for every collection, processing, and sharing of personal data. Consent reflects, or presumably reflects, an autonomous choice of the data subject, and also intends to protect that autonomy by offering what is perceived by the reformers of the GDPR who introduced the GDPR, and later on by the European Court of Justice as the fundamental right to privacy. Privacy is basically data protection. Across the Atlantic, we have a different ideology that also focuses on choice. And so choice is also located at the core of what the American loosely call information protection practices. And here, however, privacy is basically being treated as a commodity. As a commodity, it could be exchanged in the market. But since the market suffers from severe market failures, these market failures must be protected through some of the regulation that was introduced, although not as expensive as the European regulation, but more limited to particular cases, such as those that are the sectorial legislation that was introduced at the federal or state level in the United States, but also some modern privacy protection laws introduced in California and Virginia. And what is interesting about, again, this legal regime, that it aims to enable users to make a choice regarding their information, to actually reflect their true preferences regarding what will be done with their personal information, making at least what we call an informed choice regarding the collection and processing of that data. So going back to Gavizon's coherent concept of privacy, can these legal regime enhance privacy in the way Gavizon understood it? And so I think we've heard in the talk of Professor Anita Allen about some of the contributions in the 1980 paper by Gavizon. And I will just highlight three of them. One is the definition of privacy as accessibility to an individual. Gavizon defines privacy as situational, as a human condition where a human can actually, when a human is put in a situation where there is more or less access to information about him, and that is addressed by the dimension of secrecy. It relates to the extent to which the subject of information becomes subject of attention, that is addressed by anonymity. And then there is the level of physical space, control over physical space, which enable us, or the accessibility to our physical space that is addressed by the dimension of solitude. All of these three dimensions, when we look through on privacy through these lenses, are not always desirable to the individual or to us generally in society. We as humans may not always benefit from privacy itself. We may need some balance between privacy and interaction in order to constitute our autonomy, in order to maintain our human relations, in order to develop our capacity and sensibilities, and in order to create, to grow, and sometimes even to survive. So privacy is not an absolute value. It is something that sometimes would be desirable as a social matter and sometimes not. And that is an important dimension that was recognized by Gavizon in this paper. Another important point to make is that the justification that is offered by the article is instrumental, so that privacy is important only to the extent that it is serving individuals and society. It could serve liberty, it could serve autonomy, it could serve human relations, but sometimes it does not. And so the fundamental question for us is when we come to look at the law and define the scope of privacy protection is what is sufficient amount of privacy that is necessary to protect the social functions of privacy that we indeed want to promote, and also to avoid the downsides of privacy. To be the right to be let alone could be also the right not to be let alone. Sometimes you want someone to knock on your door and make sure that you're still alive there. And so, and this important, this is an important dimension, because it means that some of these decisions related to the scope of privacy protection cannot be done individually, because privacy is defined as a relational condition. Then, as a society, we need to make sure that we tailor the right to privacy in a way that would serve society as a whole. So the definition that is offered in the article not only provide a framework for understanding what privacy is, but also is important for understanding what privacy is not. The reason we value privacy, Gavison tells us in the article, may have nothing to do with whether an individual has in fact chosen it. Privacy is not about preferences or individual preferences. It is about collective action. It is about, when we talk about privacy as accessibility, it is a relational concept, not an individualistic concept. Therefore, privacy protection always entails some burden on others who may wish to access an individual in order to comprehend, to understand what she does, to learn about that other person, that other peer, that other individual, and also themselves to think and to grow through dialogue with other people. Now, back to the 21st century. Could data protection regime that was introduced in Europe and the focus on choice, notice and consent that is promoted in the United States, could they provide adequate protection of privacy in the 21st century? I actually believe that there are good reasons to doubt it, and let me just quickly list them down. So one is the fact that when we think about an ecosystem where data is actually collected and analyzed and through machine learning systems using artificial intelligence, disclosure of information no longer depends on the private individual. Data analytics enables third parties to infer information about me, that I'm a woman, that I'm white, that I'm a professional academic, regardless of whether I've provided that information in one form or another. They could do that by systematically analyzing patterns of information that were collected from other people. and that apparently share some features with me, and therefore conclude that I fit that profile, and therefore it is who I am. The other set of problems relate to what we call the privacy paradox, the fact that consent is easily given. And so we know that we all appreciate privacy, we all value privacy, we talk a lot about privacy, but we give it away really quickly, all of us, on a daily basis. And sometimes because we value the service that we want to acquire, we need to use Waze in order to avoid the traffic. And sometimes we value that more than we are concerned about the long-term effects of providing the data. But in other cases, it is because consent is something that is really difficult to acquire and also to implement on an ongoing basis. It's overwhelming. We all experienced that a couple of years ago when the GDPR was introduced, and we had to click again and again on consenting to these, accepting cookies. It's not as if that has changed our privacy situation for the better, because consent is just too hard for individuals to manage, and therefore it is not a good way of guarding against privacy invasion. The last point, and that goes back to the 1980 article, is that if privacy is a social good, the individual is not the right constituent. We don't have to ask each and every individual, and the preference of each and every individual is not necessarily what should matter. What we need to do is to decide collectively about our the protection of privacy in ways that would enable us to live in a society that protect autonomy and enable democracy and pluralism in ways that we all seek to promote. And so if choice doesn't help protect privacy, does it hurt to protect it? Maybe it's useless, but maybe it's also harmless. The main problem that is generated by this cumbersome bureaucracy, which requires to acquire consent for use of each and every piece of data, actually creates complication and huge costs that have to be carried by those who try to use and develop and deploy these systems. And so when we think about this barrier in terms of cost and professionalism that is required in order to enter a market, this is carried by startup companies or independent inventors or academics who want to maybe develop more privacy-friendly technologies and enable some competition with these powers that are now implementing surveillance, and that is multinational corporations and states. And so, in conclusion, Gavison demonstrated back in the 80s that privacy is not a matter of individual preference, that it is a social good that should be addressed through social negotiation and collective action. In the current context of the 2020s, we are now entering 2022 very soon, as we are facing growing threats to privacy from both multinational companies and governments, and again, this is especially true in the post or current pandemic situation. We need new mechanisms that would effectively restrain these powers to serve the original functions of privacy that were listed in the 1980 article by Gavison: autonomy, pluralism, and free society. This may require us to go back to the fundamental definitions of privacy discussed in the article and to develop new and innovative measures that would ensure we protect the functions of privacy in light of these new growing threats. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions if people want to.
One question or two.
Or comments or disagreements.
Disagreements. Well, it was an excellent lecture exposing again the strength of Gavison's scholarship.
Neely.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you. So, thank you, Niva, for an excellent lecture exposing, again, Gavison's scholarship. And we came to the end of this session. And tomorrow, the conference will be held at the Hebrew University, this time in Hebrew. I would like to thank the participants for the excellent expositions, and to the organizers, Shai Lavi and Yoav Dutan, and to the academy staff, Sima Daniel, Ziva Dekel, Galia Finzi, Neri. Thank you very much. Thank you all. See you tomorrow.